let's get more on the currencies out there and get to our next guest, Olivier Derbar. He is currency strategist at Credit Suisse. He's in Singapore for us this morning. Olivier, thanks for joining us. Where are we with the state of play with the euro right now?
Well, as you pointed out correctly, we've seen a chunk of last week's gains being erased. I would point out that, again, this morning we're seeing a broad dollar appreciation. So it's not just the euro that's lost ground. We've seen it across the G10 and Asian currency pairs. And it also we're seeing equity weakness. So it would seem, at the risk of sounding very generic, that once again we've started the session with a risk-off theme, which to some extent reverses the gains we'd seen in yesterday's Asian session.
It's not just the Greek concerns. I also mentioned that we've got at least one Spanish bank being nationalized. We've got another 4 regional institutions also merging here. I think it's going from bad to worse.
Well, I think to some extent that the Spanish problem's been known for a while. So the fact that one of the smaller lending banks, savings banks, should I say, has had to seek help from the restructuring fund doesn't really surprise us. As a share of the total banking system in Spain, it's still very small. So it's very clear, according to our own analysts, that we're going to see, if you want, a consolidation of the Spanish banking system. But I think it's certainly adding to concerns that we are ultimately seeing a degree of contagion. And I think it's adding to the concern that Greece's fiscal problems are ultimately just the tip of the iceberg, and that there are other larger European countries with severe fiscal stresses, in the case of Spain, created by large amounts of leverage in the banking sector related to the property market. So it's certainly, I think, adding to pressure on the euro.
Olivier, if I'm talking to you 12 months from now, where's the euro going to be?
Well, our view tends to be that for the euro to ultimately appreciate over the medium term, and I think over 12 months we do see some scope for some moderate upside from here. We first need to weaken, and the reason being is with banks basically being forced to deleverage and European governments effectively forcing a degree of fiscal tightening, and if you add to that the stresses and funding in Europe, it's really up to the central banks to loosen monetary policy and support nominal demand, nominal growth. And various central banks across the world have been doing that to a certain extent. You could argue the Fed's been doing more of that loosening than the ECB, although having said that, the ECB has expanded its balance sheet by something like 120 billion euros in recent weeks. So we actually think that monetary policy needs to remain loose in the Eurozone to compensate for this tightening of, if you want, credit growth in the private sector. And if this happens, we will see the euro weaken further. But what we think this will ultimately provide is a greater degree of competitiveness to the Eurozone, which will in turn support growth, help the fiscal deficits come down, and ultimately provide some support for the euro. So it's a case of, we think the euro has to weaken further before it can appreciate on a more sustained basis over the medium term.
Olivier, let's just talk also about, well, we talked about the Eurozone debt, but what about the UK debt? Because if you look at debt there, it's on some measures, I mean, it's the equivalent of Greece here. We do have a flexible currency, so as a result of that is the path of least resistance down for the pound.
Well, it depends against what you'd be measuring sterling. Against the euro, we actually think that the bias is for sterling to slightly outperform the euro for a number of reasons. The first one is the UK is posting somewhat stronger growth than the Eurozone, and I think we should get proof of that later on today when we get revised Q1 GDP numbers. Consensus forecast is for an upward revision to 0.3% quarter-on-quarter growth. Our economists actually think it could be as high as 0.4% quarter-on-quarter. So that's the first point, the fact that we are seeing somewhat stronger growth in the UK, which does give this new government slightly more room to cut its fiscal deficit.
Olivier, I've got very little time because I just want just to gloss over that and get to actually what's been going on in Asia as well. And we've got these talks taking place between the Chinese and the US authorities. Chinese saying that they may be willing in the future, but they won't be pushed on this, will they?
No, and that's really the rhetoric we've had for the past year. I don't think anything's changed from that perspective. What has clearly changed is that the renminbi has been appreciating against the euro and, more broadly speaking, against a basket of currencies. So I think Chinese policymakers can argue, I think quite convincingly, that the pressure for them to revalue the renminbi has to some extent dissipated compared to a few months ago. Already back in Q1, PBOC was making the point that with the renminbi appreciating slightly, this removed the pressure for them to revalue against the dollar, and I think that's a continuing trend.
Olivier, thank you so much for joining us. Olivier Despardet from Credit Suisse, talking about the foreign exchanges.